Everyone, to another edition of the Travel Show with your host Ted Blank of Ted Blank Luxury Travel and Adventure. And as we do every Thursday, it's so fun to just chat it up with our friend Ted and hear about some adventures that we could be going on. How have you been?
I've been doing well, thank you.
Great. So Ted, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, it's the time of the year that I think we should turn our gaze a little bit northward and talk about Alaska.
I love it.
Because we're entering the prime planning season for people who are thinking about traveling to Alaska in 2025. And if you're thinking about going to Alaska later, like in 2026 or even 2027, believe it or not, it's not too early to be thinking about it now.
You know, you say that, and it's just crazy to me to think that, but yet you said that a lot of times the quote-unquote best rooms and all that, they sell out fast.
I had somebody this morning that we were talking to, and they said, we're so excited to be this far ahead of the curve with planning. And I said, well, this whole side of the ship is full. There are no more staterooms there. And they couldn't really understand it. And I said, they probably sold a year ago. The world has changed. The world has really changed.
How has it changed?
I think we all thought we could sort of, what was that ad that Burger King used to have, your way, right away? And we lived in a world where everything could be done your way, right away. And that's not the case anymore. There isn't enough capacity in some cases to meet the demand. Each ship only has a certain number of
It's
suites.
finite.
Everything is finite. And a lot of people have gotten very smart about travel, and they plan further and further in advance. And so that's exciting for me because I know my clients, we've got that locked in. We don't have to worry about scrambling to find space. And I think it's always been the case. There's always been a shortage of space, but I think more and more people travel places like Alaska, they're kind of starting to collide with those realities more and more. And so, it's a destination that 18 months in advance is not too early to be planning. 9 months out, certainly a good time to be planning. When you get to 6 months, we're starting to be into the last of the crumbles left in the bottom of the chip container a little bit. So it's a good time to be planning now so you don't find yourself in that situation. And if there's one thing I could kind of shout from the rooftops, one piece of travel advice that I would give to folks is that the further ahead you plan, the better the vacation you'll have.
Because everything will fall in line with your choices.
Everything will fall in line. The choices will fall in line. And, Alaska is a very complex trip.
Oh, tell me.
There are a lot of decisions that travelers have to make when they're going to Alaska. And it starts with the time of the year. It starts with how much time you have to actually explore Alaska. It starts with, which cruise are you going to take? Which itinerary are you going to take? Which ports do you want to? And so there is a lot of decision making involved. And with Alaska, it's a little different than the Caribbean. I mean, to some extent, you can go to one island that has really nice beaches and enjoy it, or go to another island that has really nice beaches and enjoy it. I mean, the islands are all different, but they're similar enough in nature that it's sometimes they're a little bit interchangeable. But in Alaska, each port has a very distinctive experience. And the number of glaciers that you can see, the amount of time you spend exploring the glaciers, the wildlife you'll see, all of those are part of that decision-making process. And so the longer you have to consider some of those things, I think the better the overall outcome is going to be.
Do you remember in the olden days when there were fire sales on so many things?
Yeah.
Those have really gone away.
Those have really gone away. Those are like a pre-September 11th.
And why is
thing.
that?
Because the cruise lines and the airlines, I think, realized that they made more money by not having fire sales.
Okay.
Because everybody would wait for the fire sales. And it's really difficult for them to plan their operations based on that. And it comes down to demand. There's a lot more demand today than there was 15, 20 years ago for Alaskan vacations, period, for flights. And so it's just that the growth in supply across the whole travel sort of ecosystem hasn't really kept up with the growth in demand.
And why has Alaska become so popular?
It's interesting because I was a little bit of an Alaska skeptic the first
time
I went. I think we've talked about that, and it wasn't at the top of my list of places to go. But as I talked to people and I asked people, hey, if there's one place you could go next, where would it be? Alaska is by far and away the most common answer that I get. And I think it's because, first of all, it is an amazing place. And we see pictures, you might watch a movie, you might watch a documentary about Alaska, but we all know that that doesn't do it justice. The scenery is just incredible. And to see a glacier and almost be able to touch a glacier, or literally to be able to walk on a glacier.
You can feel the coldness,
You can feel
right?
the coldness. You can feel the dampness. That's not something we can do here in Wisconsin or Minnesota. We don't have too many glaciers left in this part of the country. So I think the attraction is the destination itself. And then it's mostly a domestic trip, or it's a trip that involves a trip to Canada as well as that. And so for a lot of people, Alaska maybe is the most adventurous place they'll ever go in their lifetimes.
And it's less daunting maybe
And I
than
think it can be less daunting than a European trip. For a lot of other people, it's the gateway drug. It's the first big trip they take because it is, a little bit closer and a little bit maybe feels a little bit more familiar. And then boom, the doors are open and off they go. And then they're ready to go to Europe and they're ready to go to Antarctica and all sorts of places like that. So it really depends on the person and kind of where they are in their life and their travel, things that are on their bucket list. But it is, I would say, I talked to 10 people and 8 of 10 have that at the very top of their bucket list. And the other 2 probably went already.
Oh,
so
that is so cool though, Ted.
Yeah.
So it really has picked up.
Yeah, so the number of visitors to Alaska has really increased dramatically.
Are they promoting it as a state, as a tourism piece? I mean, tourism is very important, I know, to a lot of cities and states.
Yes.
But has Alaska done that deliberately?
Yeah, Alaska has done that. Alaska for a long time depended on oil revenue to pay
Yes.
the bills, and that's kind of dried up because the price of oil is still relatively low, and so they need income. And so tourism produces income. There aren't a lot of other options for employment in Alaska in a lot of places. So tourism is certainly an important piece of the economy. It's become, I think, organic, and that people just want to go there. And so it's almost like the rest of the travel world is running in place to catch up and try to keep up with the demand and the number of people who are interested in going.
So are new ports being developed to meet this tourism need?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point. And it very true, very much so, that new ports are being developed. And so 5 years ago, every Alaskan cruise through the Inside Passage would go to the same ports. Well, there are too many ships now. And in fact, some of the ports have said, we're going to cap the number of visitors on any given day to a certain number. So, for example, the city of Juneau and the cruise lines have come to an agreement about the number of people that can visit on any given day. Well, there are still ships out there, and they have to go someplace. And so absolutely some of the cruise lines have been working with the local Alaskans, the native Alaskans, to develop new ports. Sometimes they're an existing town that they're really building out the infrastructure on. Other times they're sort of completely new ports in areas where there hadn't been ports before. So that is happening, and I think it's neat because, first of all, it increases the number of options available to the traveler. And it's also making some places in Alaska that were pretty inaccessible a lot more accessible to people. And so you can have a much deeper appreciation in some of these new ports that, they tend to be pretty small. They're not going to be as big as like a Juneau or a Ketchikan, one of the bigger ports, but they're certainly interesting and they open up new horizons for folks.
And the vastness of Alaska really, I would assume, makes it set up where you have different geography too.
Yeah, that's another very good point, because when we talk about the size of Alaska, if you were to plunk the state of Alaska on a map of the United States, one end would be at the tip of Florida and the other end would be almost in Seattle, Washington. So it's a really, really large state.
Yeah.
Yeah, when we talk about the tourist, the average tourist visiting Alaska, we're really talking about 2 parts of Alaska. One is Southeast Alaska. That's kind of the panhandle of Alaska where the Inside Passage is.
Oh, sure.
And that's where the cruises go because there's no way to get around that except by sea or by air. There aren't a lot of roads down there. And so the cruises tend to be concentrated in Southeast Alaska or the Inside Passage. And then there's what they call the rail belt. And that's the stretch of land between Anchorage and Fairbanks that basically runs along the Alaska Railroad main line, and right next to the railroad is the highway. And so that's another place where Denali National Park is, the city of Anchorage, the city of Fairbanks, the towns of Talkeetna, and some of the other towns. And that's the other kind of major tourist area of Alaska. The Kenai Peninsula is part of that. And so other than that, most of the state is kind of home to polar bears and other kinds of bears. And so I know you know a little bit about polar bears from your past life, don't you?
I do. I'm going to tell you this is good advice for you, Ted,
Okay,
because I
I'll
know
file
you
it
travel. So if you see a bear, here's how it works. If it's black, fight back.
Okay.
If it's brown, lie down.
Lie on the ground. Okay.
If it's white, good night.
Yeah, I hear polar bears are a little temperamental. The part of Alaska, in all seriousness, where the polar bears are is really the far north in the Arctic. Mm-hmm. And tourism there is minuscule. There's just a little bit of tourism that would get you up there. So fortunately, you wouldn't encounter a polar bear. But brown bears and black bears are very commonly seen. I've seen them many times when I've been in Alaska. And I've lived to tell the tale, so that's always good. But yeah, it is a vast, vast, vast state. And there are more bears than people in Alaska.
Wow.
So, yeah, not even counting the polar bears.
Wow, that's crazy. So the Inside Passage would be a cruise, but you mentioned Denali National Park, and do people want to go there as well, and how do they go there?
Yep, that's another excellent question, and that's a very commonly asked question that my team and I get about Alaska, and that is, we want to see this and we want to see this, and how do we do this? And so there are cruises that will run one way from Vancouver in Canada, and they'll run up to one of the ports for Anchorage. And so along the way, you'll spend about a week exploring the Inside Passage. You get off the ship, you walk across the pier, and you board a train, and you head north to Anchorage, to Denali National Park, and to Fairbanks. And you can do it in both directions, so you could go in the other direction as well. So that's the most popular way to do that. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of different permutations on kind of that main route. But that Alaskan experience, the core of it is a 7-night cruise, one way, followed by or preceded by a land program in Alaska for, anywhere between 3 and 12 days. Some of those land programs go as far afield as the Yukon Territory. And so there are all sorts of options depending on the amount of time you have and your interests to kind of make a unique trip. Other people just want to take the cruise and they just want to concentrate on Southeast Alaska. And so those cruises are often round-trip cruises from either Seattle or Anchorage. 7 to 10 days is a typical length for those. But if you do one of those round-trip cruises, you won't have the opportunity to go to Denali on that particular trip. You'll go back where you started from.
And on these cruises, is it all different kinds of ships? Can you explain that?
Yeah. So as many flavors of cruise ships as exist in the world exist in Alaska. So there are big family-oriented ships. There are mid-sized ships that are geared towards adults or maybe families with grown-up kids. There are smaller expedition-type cruise ships and kind of everything in between. So there is a cruise in Alaska really for everyone. All levels of budget from kind of the mass market, big name cruise lines up to the real exclusive deluxe small ship cruise lines. And they all operate in Alaska.
So if somebody wants to dip their toe in, I suppose it depends upon the person. So you can't even one size fits all. What would be a great
one size doesn't fit all. And one of the conversations I'll oftentimes have with people about Alaska is to talk a little bit about getting older. And Alaska is a place where I think the younger you are and the better physical health you're in, probably the better the experience you're going to have, because you'll be able to go out and do some of those hikes and get out into nature a little bit. Whereas if you have, mobility problems and stuff, you're just going to miss that piece of the trip. But if you do have some mobility problems and you really just want to enjoy the scenery, you can certainly do that as well. So it lends itself well to both. But I think if you're thinking kind of strategically about places I want to go over the next 10 or 20 years, I would put Alaska in as an early place to go because, again, the more you can get outdoors and off the beaten path a little bit to see nature up close and personal, that really adds to the experience.
So what are some of the ports that we would encounter in that Inside Passage?
Yeah, so if we're kind of going northbound from Vancouver, kind of visualize in our heads that, the first port is Ketchikan. Ketchikan is the largest city in Southeast Alaska. It's a fishing destination. So if you want to fish for halibut, salmon during the salmon season, you can fish in Ketchikan. It has a historic little red light district. So if you want to know what life was like in Alaska before the law and order arrived, Ketchikan has that. And it also has a very interesting native Alaskan village. So you can learn about what life was like in Alaska before the Europeans arrived. Then as you go north, Juneau is typically the next port. And Juneau is Alaska's capital. It's a great spot to go whale watching. The whales kind of keep their eyes on the politicians to try to keep them honest in Alaska. So there are a lot of whales near Juneau, and it's a great place to go whale watching. It's a really, really scenic, beautiful, beautiful city. There's also a glacier there that you can explore, and you can actually almost get to touch the glacier. It's called Mendenhall Glacier. It's actually in a park right on the edge of town. Skagway is another city, and it's kind of the north end of the Inside Passage. And it's where the Klondike Gold Rush took place in the 1890s. And so there is a narrow gauge railroad that was built to support the gold rush that you can ride.
Oh, wow.
Now it's a scenic tour train. One of my favorite, I think probably my favorite city in Alaska is probably Skagway, I would say. Across the bay from Skagway is a smaller town called Haines. And if you watch the show Yukon Vet, that's where she lives. She lives in Haines, Alaska. I don't know why they call her the Yukon Vet because she lives in Alaska.
Okay.
But anyway, much more remote, isolated place, although it is actually connected to the road network. And there's a place called Sitka which
Oh,
is
I've
on
heard of
an
that.
island. Sitka was the Russian capital of Alaska. It's also a fantastic spot to go look for bears. It's also got a very interesting outdoor totem pole national monument. And so you can see totem poles as they existed when they were in active use. So put in the ground outside on a beach. And that's a real neat experience. There's a little town called Icy Strait Point in Alaska, which used to be a salmon cannery. You and I are probably a little too young to remember, but people used to not be able to get fresh fish in the lower 48. And so they would catch the salmon and they would can it.
Oh, a canned salmon
Yeah.
is a thing.
Yeah,
Sure.
and not as
Yeah.
much as it used to be,
Yeah.
certainly. But in the day, that was the only way you got salmon.
It smells terrible.
It smells terrible. Yeah, it actually tastes pretty good. You can make a nice, like a little salmon
Yeah.
dip out of it. But there's a interesting port there called Icy Strait Point on an island that again has more bears than people, so it's a good place to go bear watching. It's also fantastic whale watching. Every time I've been to Icy Strait Point, you can actually literally almost sit on your balcony on your cabin and look out, and you'll see a whale eventually. And I always like to tell this story. There's a really good little restaurant in Icy Strait Point, and they have crab legs, Alaskan king crab legs. And so they bring it out to you. And it's kind of a pretty typical Alaskan place, not a lot of frills there.
Sure.
The crabs come in a paper boat. And so then if you want to have butter for your crab, you walk up to the front and there's a crock pot full of melted butter. And I mean, who can ever resist a crock pot full of melted butter? There's a language of love there, right? The Alaskan language of love. And they also actually make some really good beers in Alaska. So there's a microbrewery there. And then as you head north, there are also the glaciers that you can visit, which really aren't ports of call because the ship doesn't dock. But Glacier Bay National Park, Hubbard Glacier, College Fjord, Misty Fjords. There are quite a few different glaciers that you can visit. That's really a highlight of the Alaskan cruise. And then the sailing will end in one of the two ports for Anchorage that are called Seward and Whittier. And that's where you would board a train then and head up north, further into Alaska if you wanted to. Some of the cruises that do a round trip from Seattle or Vancouver will also call it Victoria in British Columbia. Beautiful garden there called the Butchart Gardens. Another amazing place to stop.
I think we just probably hit the tip of the iceberg on this, no pun intended. So I know you want to keep talking about Alaska somewhere down the line.
Yeah, I think we'll talk a little bit about it next week, and we'll give you some kind of new things that are happening in 2026. And we've put together a little tool to help people plan an Alaskan trip that we can talk about next week as well.
I love that. Ted, how can people get a hold of you, please?
Yeah, you can give me a call at 651-964-8245. You can visit my website at tedblanktravel.com, or you can visit our office at 206 Locust Street in downtown Hudson.
So great to see you. Thank you so much. Ted Blank of Ted Blank Luxury Travel and Adventure, and this show is called The Travel Show.